Hey, you're on the Bible Forum. Can't even talk. I'm Warren Sprouse. We're here for the next couple of hours. Would love for you to join us in the chat room. Love for you to send me an email so I can get your email address. I'll put you on my list. You'll get an email, 4-color email, every Saturday. I don't do anything else unless there's an emergency. I sent out one of those years ago. It had to do with something that was happening with the internet, and it was important that we know this stuff. But this evening, this is December 10th, 2017. I want to talk to you a little bit about what President Trump has done this week in declaring Jerusalem to be Israel's capital city. I have two very dear friends who are Jewish missionaries, and getting my email this week, and I commented on this. One of them said, no, he didn't do that. And the other one said, thank you. That's exactly what he did. Well, he didn't do that, but that's exactly what he did. Embassies of nations exist in capital cities around the world, and moving our embassy to Jerusalem is another way of saying that we consider Jerusalem to be the capital city of Israel. So Trump did not make it so, but he is reinforcing that idea. In response to that, from Israel's Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, he says, thank you for today's historic decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital city. The Jewish people and the Jewish state will be forever grateful. We are profoundly grateful for the president for his courageous and just decision. Israel will always ensure freedom of worship for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Now keep in mind that all Israeli defense forces have been put on high alert because in response to this, the Palestinian leaders in the region have called for days of rage. It wondered most of us whether or not Israel would shut down the Temple Mount this weekend. They did not. And even Arabs are expressing gratitude that Israel had the presence of mind and the courage to stay away from that. Can you imagine thousands of young Islamic men forming right there in Jerusalem on this Temple Mount to be led by anybody that came up and could get them to move in a certain direction? I mean, it would have been chaos. The temptation was to shut it down, but they didn't do that. And of course, the Islamic population is grateful. Jerusalem's status is one of the most sensitive and inflammatory issues fueling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel claims that that city, Jerusalem, in its entirety, is their capital city. Palestinians, on the other hand, want the eastern sector to be their seat of government for a future state that they would establish. Pope Francis defended the status quo of Jerusalem. He did that hours ahead of the announcement by our president, saying, quote, I cannot silence my deep concern over the situation that has emerged in recent days. At the same time, he said, I appeal strongly to all for respect of the city's status quo in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions. The Turkish government spokesman, a deputy prime minister, said on Twitter just Wednesday that the United States' decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel will plunge the region and the world into what he called, quote, a fire with no end in sight, end of quote. The editor of the Washington Free Beacon wrote, declaring Jerusalem a capital is disregarding history and the truths in the region. It is a big injustice, cruelty, short-sightedness, foolishness, madness. It is plunging the region and the world into a fire with no end in sight. Arguments from critics focus on the anger it generates among Palestinians, endangering the peace process. Others are concerned it will drive a wedge between Israel and the Arab world, right at the moment when the threat from Iran is bringing them all together, the Arab world, that is, all together. The most serious argument against recognition is that it will spark Arab violence, which it did. It's an argument aggressively promoted by former Obama administration officials and their media allies, as well as by Palestinian and Jordanian officials. Interestingly, it also brings the most enthusiastic support for President Trump from leading Democrats than he has ever received. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Jew, told the Weekly Standard Tuesday that he had advised Trump to declare Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital. Now, the reality is that none of this is Trump's idea. A 1995 law declares Jerusalem should, quote, remain an undivided city and be recognized as the capital of the state of Israel, end of quote, but allows the President of the United States to issue waivers every 6 months, delaying the move of the embassy for national security reasons. The Senate reaffirmed that law in June of this year. It has been reaffirmed several times, almost unanimously. Mr. Schumer in October called on Trump to move the U.S. Embassy and argued that doing so would show the world that the U.S. definitively acknowledges Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, you realize that the big issue is just that. Who does it belong to? Well, I want to take you down a little historical path, because we need to look at whose claim to Jerusalem is the most valid. Because the battle is raging between Judaism and Islam as to who or which has the greatest claim, specifically to the Temple Mount. Israel, of course, points to their written history. We have that in our homes. It's called the Old Testament. And that is the primary writings. But there's also writings and historical presence of the city since the days of King David, which was dated from about 1020 BC, which is over 1,500 years before Muhammad was ever born. Prior to this, Jerusalem was a Canaanite city-state standing between the house of Benjamin and the house of Judah. David was the one. He moved the Ark of the Covenant, which had been captured by the Philistines, to a tent in this city, and thereby established Jerusalem as his capital. That was 1010 BC. Israel maintained a continual presence there until 70 AD, when the Roman general Titus sacked the city and tore down the temple. Now, history tells us that the temple walls were lined with gold. And when the Romans took the city, they wanted that gold. And we're told how that they burned the temple, melting the gold. And then they tore the walls apart and even tore up the floor to get at the gold. Islam points to their oral history of what is referred to as the Dome of the Rock. This is the place from whence Muhammad is supposed to have launched into heaven riding a white horse in order to discuss things with Allah. Historically, not oral history, Genesis chapter 14, Abraham is recorded as fighting a coalition of 4 kings from the east during a period when each city-state had its own ruling dynasty of kings. This event had to have been at a time in Mesopotamian history when no individual dynasty had complete control over the region. The dating for this period is between 2000 and 1750 BC. Muslims, on the other hand, didn't arrive on the scene till well after 570 AD. That's the birth of Muhammad. But after his death, Omar arrived in Jerusalem 638 AD. By then, the Islamic direction of prayer was toward Mecca. Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, very much south. Well, I guess it's more west, but it's southwest of where Jerusalem is. Islam, which like Christianity has many of its spiritual roots in Judaism, recognized the Jewish connection to the Temple Mount. And one early Islamic name for the Temple Mount was something I can't pronounce, but it means literally holy temple. The name used today is Al-Quds, and it's based on the Hebrew word for holy. Muslims have also used the Arabic form of Zion to describe it. But why Jerusalem? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Historians suggest it came about due to an instability in the Islamic world during the Islamic dynasty in 658 AD. The Caliphate lost control of Mecca, and since one of the 5 pillars of Islam requires a pilgrimage, they needed a replacement. Jerusalem was close to Mecca, hundreds of miles, but close. And there in Jerusalem there was a rock. The former site of the Jewish temple, now destroyed, included the place where Muhammad's steed was supposed to have launched from earth to heaven to confer with God. The Quran describes the trip, the ascension, accompanied by Gabriel. They traveled around the heavens and spoke with Allah and other prophets. Construction for what was to be called the Dome of the Rock began in 688 AD. Also, scholars believe the Caliph at the time wished to compete with the Church of the Sepulchre, which is there in Jerusalem, where tradition has it that Jesus was buried. In fact, the dimensions of the present Dome of the Rock are the exact same as the rotunda of that sepulchre. Now, the downside for Islam is that Jerusalem is never mentioned in the Quran. So the magical ride of Muhammad and the rock from which he launched, a ride, it was on a flying horse that had a face of a woman and a tail of a peacock. The narrative comes from their writing, Surah 17, which describes, "Glory be to him who carried his servant by night from the holy mosque in Mecca to further mosque, Al-Aqsa, the precincts of which we have blessed." Now, the actual location of this Al-Aqsa, the further mosque in Muhammad's dream ride, is never mentioned. Some early Muslims understood that this meant metaphorical reality. It was a place in heaven, or just to speak of a place. It didn't have an actual literal place. The troubling issue is whether or not Jerusalem, or more specifically Mount Moriah, is Jewish or Muslim. Mount Moriah is where the Temple Mount exists. It's a place sacred to Israel. It's where Abram sought to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. It's also believed to be where Jacob saw the vision of a staircase to heaven with angels ascending and descending. Jacob called it Bethel, the house of God. And it would have been on the ridge of the mountain called Moriah. Moriah is an elongated stretch of land running north-south, with the Mount of Olives on the east, very close to where the Temple Mount now stands. Both events occurring well before the birth of Muhammad, and therefore before any Muslim. In addition, scholars such as British-based Imam Sheikh Mohammed al-Husani assert that early Muslim intellectuals recognized that Israel belonged to Jews. He said, quote, "You will find very clearly that the traditional commentators from the 8th to the 9th century onwards have uniformly interpreted the Quran to say explicitly that the land of Israel had been given by God to the Jewish people as a perpetual covenant. And, well, there is no Islamic counterclaim to the land anywhere in the traditional corpus of commentary, Islamic. Now, the problem with all of that is that it's refuted by other Muslim experts. They maintain this relies upon a partial and inaccurate reading of the Quran. The argument is primarily based on Quran, chapter 5, verse 21, in which Moses declares, "O my people, enter the holy land which God has prescribed for you, and turn not back in your traces to turn about losers." He then cites the classic Quranic commentator Muhammad ibn Jarir at-Tabari, writing 838-923 AD. He explains that this statement is a narrative from God concerning the sayings of Moses to his community from among the children of Israel, and his order to them according to the order of God to him, ordering them to enter the Holy Land. Another issue is the Islamic law that forbids a non-Muslim be assigned a status of ruler over Muslims or over Muslim territory. Prior to 1948, Israel was never in a position to be this sort of ruler. Under former Muslim dominations, Israel and Jews were kept firmly in their place, representing no threat to Islam. Islam in the beginning was independent of Israel and running roughshod over the whole of what was called the Levant: Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, as well as North Africa, Spain, Turkey. But now Israel, since 1948, is in a place to rule over Muslims. Not that they choose to do that, but Muslims want to live in Jerusalem. They want to be citizens. They ask for it. They serve in their Knesset. Israel is in a place to have authority over Muslims. But Sharia law, the sacred texts, forbid such a situation. Muslim scholar who suggests Israel belonged to Jews also points to the Hebrew scriptures where Israel rejects the land God gave them at Kadesh Barnea and the subsequent wandering of 40 years in the wilderness without a home. And he says, see, God promised this to them, they rejected it. In contrast, the Muslim Ummah community is more respected and honored before God and has a more perfect legislative code and system of life, he says. It has the most honorable prophet, the larger kingdom, more provisions, wealth, and children, a larger domain and more lasting glory than the children of Israel. Well, by my observation, the only way they would have more provisions and wealth is because of Western need for oil, and the Western nations going over there to actually do the work to get the oil, and they just take the profit. They didn't actually do anything. I digress. Others insist that since Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Quran by name, it is actually the Sinai which is most important, it having been mentioned more often. Yes, Jerusalem is holy, but Sinai is more holy. Because Israel rebelled against God, they are transgressors, therefore God has turned his attention to the Muslim. And according to Surah 9, those who believe in God, speaking of Islam, are to, quote, fight those who believe not in God, and that to the last day. Non-Muslims, that's you, unbelievers are required to pay the tax as long as they disbelieve. You live in their country, in their town, you pay their tax. The tax ensures your security. That tax is imposed on unbelievers in an effort to humiliate them. And in most cases, it increases incrementally until the unbeliever is completely destitute and therefore becomes slaves to the Muslim. This is the boiling pot. These are the conflicting issues that rage in the Middle East around Jerusalem. And they get more complex as the days go by, as other nations step in to either help. Persia, which is Muslim, Russia. There are other nations that step up. We, the United States, Great Britain, Europe, we're interested because they got our oil. If it wasn't for the oil, I don't think we'd care one way or another. Look for this to get worse before it gets better. The Bible clearly indicates that it will continue to get worse until Jesus comes and stops it. Some of us, as we see these war drums pounding, it breaks our heart, it scares us to death, and at the same time, it gets our heart beating that Jesus may be closer than we think. Keep your eyes on the eastern horizon. Let's see what happens. It's going to be an interesting 2018.